Dear Jeb, I hope you are doing well. Let's discuss limitations. Limitations can make the game more fun. If you want to play without limitations, then you can just play creative mode. Some people prefer survival mode because of the restrictions and challenges it offers, and that's good evidence that suggests limits can indeed make games more fun. I'll be going over how limits are used in Minecraft and how they can be changed or improved. So here is a list of ways features can limit the player. Number 1, expense. Beacons can be difficult to get and therefore limiting how many the player can use. Diamonds are hard to find and therefore the player is limited by how many diamond blocks they want in their build. It's a simple and intuitive limitation, but unfortunately it does not apply to everyone. The downside is, well, rich players are not as affected by these limits. They can put beacons wherever the heck they want thanks to their epic wither farms. As time goes on, eventually rich players will just not feel the limitations of expense. Number 2, scarcity. This is like expense, but on a grander scale. This kind of limitation has the opposite effect on rich players. For example, after you've explored a few mansions, totems of undying become invaluable, to the point where no one will use them anymore because of how rare and depleted they have become. This is an interesting way of limiting the player, but unfortunately becomes extremely limiting, sometimes too limiting, for long-term worlds. Number 3, debuffs. If rotten flesh is so abundant and so cheap, why don't we use it as a food source? Oh yeah, the hunger. This is a great way of limiting the player because it gives the player a choice, or sometimes the illusion of choice. Rotten flesh can be used as a food source, but isn't viable due to the hunger effect it gives. This also applies to builders. Why don't we use soul sand in our floors? Oh yeah, because it slows us down. Why don't we put a fireplace here? Oh yeah, because our house is made of wood. Personally, I believe this is the best type of limitation because it gives the player a risk versus reward scenario. It also allows items to have a use without them being too overpowered. It also affects all players, no matter how far you are into the game. It also encourages players to think creatively and think of a workaround for that particular debuff. Number 4, special cases. Some items require very special circumstances to be obtained. Silk Touch comes to mind for certain ore blocks. Nether stars require killing a wither. This is like scarcity and expense, but I feel like it deserves its own category. Just like expensive materials don't limit players, special cases rarely limit rich players either. Number 5, not including the feature in the first place. This is the most powerful a limitation can get, the most controversial solution. Builders don't use andesite stairs not because they're expensive, not because they're rare, not because they burn the house down, but because they simply don't exist. Because of this, players resort to not building the house out of andesite at all, or simply using stone brick stairs. A common argument for this is that it makes us think more creatively. A common argument against this is that it makes us think less creatively. All in all, I believe that while this method has its pros, it should be avoided if possible. We need to rethink how limitations are imposed on the player. Rather than just omitting the feature completely, we should try to find other ways to limit a feature first. When there are people submitting bug reports for missing crafting recipes or missing features, it might be worthwhile to acknowledge that something isn't working in the design. If you really want to limit the player, let's think of a limitation that isn't simply leaving the feature out entirely. Now, I would love to end the video there, but I feel like this video will be incomplete without some examples. Let's discuss the omission of the haste potion. No haste potion, fair enough. A haste potion could potentially be overpowered and could make the beacon more redundant. Instead of leaving them out of the game entirely, let's make them somewhat expensive. Maybe it requires an ingredient that is rarely dropped by mobs. Maybe witch dust or stray dust should rarely be dropped by those mobs. Or perhaps we could make it scarce and make haste potions only found in dungeon loot. Those are the two ways we could balance that. I personally prefer scarcity because rich players won't be affected anymore once they get beacons. Let's discuss how magma cannot be used as a fuel source. That'd be overpowered, right? Well, not if we make it so magma smelts an item on a 1-to-1 ratio. It's a huge limitation because lava is probably more efficient, but the option is at least present and accessible for players to use. Also, as I discussed in an earlier video, instead of preventing the player entirely from combining mending and infinity on a bow, give the player a debuff which makes the bow expensive in a different way, like making the durability run out faster so you need even more experience to repair it. To recapitulate my point, there are other ways of providing limitations for the player. Before we remove a feature to achieve this, we should consider other ways we could give the player that limitation. It keeps consistency, it keeps the options open, it keeps the balance. Thanks for watching.